And good morning. We are live in Paris and you are listening to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Andrew Mueller. It has been a week since we took up residence here at Maison Allianz on the 16th floor at the Sceaux Hotel in Paris. Coming up today, journalist Colette Davidson brings us the latest news from right here in the French capital. We'll cross to Saint-Moritz, where Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, is standing by. After that, we're ready to run. Kieran FitzPatrick, New Balance's global vice president of running, tells us about his brand's post-Olympic ambitions. Also ahead, Monocle's roving Olympics correspondent Kieran Pender will be joining us from the heart of the action. Kieran, what do you have for us?
Good morning, Andrew. From no wind in Marseille for the sailing to an Afghan female sprinter in Paris with a message for the Taliban, there's plenty of news coming from the heart of the action.
So more from Kieran later in the show. Also, the founders of Yves Roger Athletics will be here to tell us about their brand, blending athleticism, streetwear and African culture. And we'll be going to Brisbane, where journalist Paul Osbourne recaps Australia's performance at the Games so far and brings us some aviation news. It's the 3rd of August 2024. Live from Paris, this is Monocle on Saturday. Good morning, this is Monocle on Saturday. I'm Andrew Mueller, joining you from Maison Allianz in Paris. Allianz is the worldwide insurance partner of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I'm joined, first of all, and with more to come, by Colette Davidson, a local journalist who often contributes to the Christian Science Monitor. Colette, good morning.
Good morning, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. We will be talking to you much more shortly, but first, for somebody who, obviously knows this city well and is familiar with the mood during the build-up to the Olympics, what have you made of week one?
Well, it's definitely not what anyone expected. I spoke the other day about this skepticism or even indifference towards the Olympic Games in Paris. So a lot of French people just ditched town.
But what could be more French than a combination of skepticism and indifference?
I know, right? It's such the stereotype, and they kind of lived up to it. And on that one, a lot of people were worried about these, congested streets and restrictions, getting around the city, having to work from home. And so they just left. The city, was empty just days before the Olympics began. But now that they've started, people are super enthusiastic. The fan zones are full. You hear cheering on the streets. I was up early this morning to come here, and there were already people flooding the metros. So, and people are actually coming. I don't know if they're leaving their vacation to come back to Paris for the Olympics, but I'm hearing about regrets of people who wish they had stayed to get in on this energy.
Colette, do stay with us. We will have more from you shortly. But first, we're going to Saint-Moritz, where Monocle's editorial director is standing by. Tyler, good morning. You were here when we set up our pop-up studio. Are you among those who now regrets having fled Paris?
Good morning, Andrew. Yes, but I have to say, I have my own almost sort of mini Olympic viewing in front of me, because I'm speaking to you from Saint-Moritz. We're about 2,000 meters above sea level here. So normally in any summer, this is a spot where there's a lot of track and field training, a lot of running going on, because of course at 2,000 meters, then when you get down to the heights or the lowlands of Paris, of course, you're going to be much better around any track, or certainly you have to cover some 40 kilometers for a marathon. And I'm just watching now a lot of people just doing laps around the lake at high speed. So my question is whether we still have some people who are training here who are going to be flying into Paris to be on full Olympic form. But to the core of your question, yeah, I am missing a little bit. I bumped into someone from On Running, one of the founders, who I believe is going to be on the show a little bit later in the week. And he hadn't been to Paris for the start of it, but I guess he was there for a full 10-day run. So it wouldn't be bad to come back.
I mean, does the Olympics consume the attention of Switzerland, or is Switzerland a country that tunes in more to the Winter Games?
No, I think that there is a lot of focus, excitement, certainly around Mr. Ponti, who's done reasonably well in swimming. Of course, he's not in the Marchand leagues as we've seen. And no, of course, this is not a nation which is known for summer sporting prowess in the same way as winter. But nevertheless, I would imagine if you are the Swiss Olympic Committee, you're probably focusing a lot on actually being and what can happen at resorts like this one high up in the mountains, where there is so much summer activity. There's so much mountain biking, there's so much road cycling, there's climbing, you've got, I would say, maybe not half of the pursuits but certainly a third of the pursuits are actively pursued. And also, of course, a lot of nations do set up their training camps, whether it's in the Dolomites, whether it's in this part of Switzerland, whether it's high above Grenoble. And of course, as the world changes, I can imagine that if you're an Olympic committee, you want to maybe shift a few of your resources, that being the euros, francs, US dollars that you have to spend, maybe a little bit more on the summer.
And Tyler, just finally, and this may be a question actually better answered from outside Paris, Monocle, of course, does think a lot about national branding and about city branding and about what nations and cities project of themselves overseas. Seen from abroad, if not necessarily that far abroad, but what impression do you think Paris is conveying of itself after 1 week?
Well, this was the amazing thing, and I think just listening of course, to our guest this morning, there was that strange feeling, Andrew, and of course we touched on it as well, even up until, 8 days ago now, but even up until Friday afternoon, even lunchtime last Friday, 7 hours away from the start of the Olympics, of the opening ceremonies, the city still felt, strangely dead. And then, of course, it came to life, and I have to say, I've been watching the output across a variety of channels, Swiss television, BBC, France 2, etc., and the backdrop looks extraordinary. I think the energy, you feel it, and you see, of course, packed arenas, packed stadiums, and I think it is. And listen, the chatter when you, of course, speak to people who aren't there, I think everyone feels very positive. I think everyone has this sense that actually Paris is doing a very good job. Of course, there's 1 week to go, so wheels can, of course, spin off. But I guess, your sense as well, what was it actually like, Andrew, going into the stadium in terms of organization, of course, aside from it being a complete pressure cooker inside?
We did have an amount of difficulty finding our seats, but I'm prepared to concede that may have been more of an us thing than a them thing. But getting everybody in and out did seem to go pretty seamlessly. The mood at the game was really upbeat and positive. Even the Malian fans did seem to enjoy it despite the result. And so far I've not heard any meaningful complaints from anybody about just the basic experience of being here as a fan.
Yeah, it's. I think that's one of the interesting things about viewing as well, and of course, maybe sort of being here in Switzerland, where you have, of course, the telecom operators, whoever you buy your cable package or your satellite package from here, because Switzerland is a nation of French and Italian and German, and of course a lot of expat English, because you have this array of channels that you don't have if you're sitting in the UK or probably many other countries. So that's the fascinating thing, Andrew, watching how the French, of course, cover things versus how the BBC is doing it versus, of course, other nations as well. And I always think, actually, what are the budgets like in Switzerland? Because you think, okay, BBC has to just cover everything in English. But in Switzerland, you have to have a deployment from, a smallish state broadcaster where they have to be doing, of course, at the same level across all three languages. So it's the complexity of that is enormous. But here's one thing. I don't know if you've seen this. And it's a question. It's one to ponder. I would love an answer in a week's time. Have you noticed in all of these, grand studio setups, I can say, of course, where you are in Maison Allianz, you're at a table. You have some microphones in front of you. But it's almost the return of the handheld mic, Andrew. Everywhere you sort of look, it's not headsets with sort of the golf ball in front. It's not sort of the classic sort of football broadcasting setup. Every network seems to have gone for the big, spongy, whether it's France 2, whether it's Rai, whoever the broadcaster is, everyone's gone for the handheld mic. And I'm wondering why it's made a comeback.
We can look into that, I think, in coming days. Tyler, we will be checking back in with you tomorrow. Thank you for the moment. You are listening to Monocle on Saturday, and we will look now at what is making news here in the French capital. Still with us is Colette Davidson. Colette, it's a week on, people are still arguing about the opening ceremony, which does suggest that it did at least part of its job.
Yes. Well, I mean, the French are nothing if not controversial, right? Mm-hmm. I think the word that has come up a lot with the opening ceremonies is audace, so audacious. And there was definitely that aspect to the opening ceremonies. Notably, there was a scene which people, mostly on the far right, are criticizing, saying that it was, spoof of the Last Supper. We saw this man completely covered in blue paint to being, somebody pulled what would you call it? Something that covers a turkey at a Thanksgiving dinner maybe. And he appeared, and then there was a drag show, and it really was trying to show the diversity in France. But since then, Thomas Joly, who was the artistic director of the opening ceremony, has received threats, harassment, and he's actually filed an official complaint about it.
But we have heard the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, leaping to his defense.
Yes, definitely. And as well as President Emmanuel Macron. They both have defended the opening ceremony, saying once again that it represents the diversity of France, and there was no reason to not include that. And so, hopefully, putting those naysayers to rest. Yeah.
I mean, we were talking a bit at the top about how this whole thing has so far, touch wood, gone remarkably well, and obviously this is quite a difficult thing for the French to come to terms with, because if there is anything the French do enjoy, it is sort of complaining about, well, everything to do with France, which does baffle the onlooker or the incomer. It's certainly always baffled me, because every time I've ever come to France, I've just thought, this is great.
Yeah, I mean, there is something about French culture where when you meet someone for the first time, you say, "Ça va? Oui, ça va." It's like, "Hello, yeah, it's fine." And you say, "Oh, this is not going very well." But actually, and then they'll go into something positive. But the way that people relate to one another here is often with something not great, because if they were too enthusiastic, too positive, that would actually be looked down upon a little bit. And so I think it's really interesting to see the French being so enthusiastic and, no holds barred, just putting the paint all over their face and waving the French flag and cheering in the street. And that for me is really surprising.
I mean, has it helped that, and I do acknowledge this grudgingly, because the French face of the games, your local hero who has stepped up, is thwarting my people, the Australians, short of the glory in the swimming pool to which we feel ourselves entitled.
You must be talking about Léon Marchand.
Reluctantly, yes.
Yes, he is the 22-year-old phenom. He's now won 4 medals in these Olympics.
All right.
And yeah, not to rub it in, but he has. And he actually trained a bit on my home turf in the U.S. And this has really brought French people together. I don't think that was an expected outcome. And I feel like every day I hear more cheering from balconies, and then I flip on the TV. Oh, who was it? It was Léon Marchand once again. So, he is kind of bringing people together right now and creating even more enthusiasm.
But is he possibly bringing people back to Paris, do you think? There has been this phenomenon reported in a few places of people who joined the stampede to leave Paris before the Olympics began and are now watching on their TVs that everybody seems to be having a good time and thinking, should I cancel my holiday?
Yeah, I don't know if people are going so far as canceling their vacation, because really that is a sacred thing. I mean, just they announced this morning about the traffic in going from Paris, going south, that it's just going to be stop and go for the rest of the day. Tomorrow, probably the same. As soon as France reaches August 1st, everyone just flees the city. I mean, I don't know how much you had time this morning to walk around, but the streets are even more empty than they were yesterday. So they may not be coming back from their vacation necessarily, but I have definitely heard of people regretting, or just, maybe they weren't planning on watching, but now they're flipping on the TV and watching the Olympics.
Just finally and briefly then, with week 2 looming, what are you personally most looking forward to? Do you have a ticket to anything?
I do. I'm going to see the gymnastics final. So I was a former gymnast, so I'm really excited to see Simone Biles, hopefully, on Monday. And then I'm also going to see some diving. So I'm pretty excited about that.
You do? Well, you should be excited about that. That is the hottest ticket, I think. It must be, to see Simone Biles.
Definitely.
Colette Davidson, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to Monocle on Saturday. You're listening to Monocle on Saturday. I'm Andrew Mueller. Now, at any Olympic Games, though the athletes running, jumping and throwing stuff in the main arena come from many nations, they do have one thing in common, which is that they are, by and large, wearing shoes, which makes any Olympic Games extremely interesting to the people who make them. Well, I'm joined now by Kieran FitzPatrick, New Balance's Global Vice President of Running. Kieran, is it possible to explain how big a deal an Olympic Games is to a company like New Balance?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thanks for having me this morning. What a beautiful view we have up here, huh?
It is quite something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Olympic Games are incredibly important just for athletics in general. And as a brand that really supports these athletes and competing at the pinnacle of the sport, we're always focused on the next 4 years and making sure that we're equipping them and making sure that they're ready so that they can show up on the biggest stage in the world and really compete at the highest levels. So it's incredibly important for us. A lot of our work towards the games starts 4 years prior. And so this is kind of the culmination of all of that work and really allowing the athletes to go out there and do their thing.
So how do you go about forging a relationship with a particular athlete? How does that come together?
Yeah, we always like to say we're the most boutique athletic brand in the world. And so we really treat our partnerships through that filter. We're always looking at these athletes at a very young age and really trying to identify who is going to be the biggest breakout talent in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now. A lot of our athletes, Sydney McLaughlin, was running in New Balance as a high school track and field athlete. And so you'll see that we invest in these athletes at a very young age. We like to form a partnership with them and make sure it's a two-way partnership. And so as they grow in the ranks and they move from becoming an amateur to a professional, we've got that strong bond and they tend to stay with our brand.
But has this been a big shift in strategy and, I guess, corporate culture for New Balance? Because I know it's going back a fair way, but your whole thing used to be the whole endorsed by nobody.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that one up. That comes up pretty often around both internally and externally. I think the thing to remember about endorsed by no one was we didn't want to pay people to wear our shoes. We didn't want that to be the motivation for why they were wearing our product. We believed that we had the best product in the category, the best product in the industry. And so athletes should want to wear them because it's the best product, because it's the highest quality, because we pay so much attention to craft. And so that has stayed with our culture. That is still a very big part of the culture at New Balance. But what you're finding is, we've got a lot of athletes that are coming to us and saying, hey, I love your product. I love the brand. I love the values and the culture. Let's start a partnership. And that's where we've kind of moved from endorsed by no one and saying partnerships matter in this industry. But it also matters for just building the brand and making sure that these young athletes that are the amateurs are seeing what they can do as professionals.
I mean, how precise a correlation are you ever able to draw between success on the track and what gets sold in shops? Does it make a difference to New Balance's bottom line if your athletes win or not?
Yeah, it's very tough to correlate those things with very specific data. We do always see, we like to say that when you're relevant in the culture of the sport, then you start to see a nice lift in sales. Having professional athletes that are running in your product and representing your brand and are a good partner for the brand is being relevant in culture. You can't just have professional athletes on the track and think that your entire running business is going to grow. So much of our focus has been on community and really making sure that we're establishing really strong community efforts with local run crews, even, the local track and field clubs in North America specifically.
So who have you been or are most excited about seeing compete at these games?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we've got an amazing lineup of athletes that are here in Paris this week, but I got to say that Femke Bol and Sydney McLaughlin in the 400-meter hurdle is going to be, I think that's going to be the story of the games, especially for track and field. So I'm really excited to see what happens this week.
And thinking beyond this, I mean, at any given moment, how many partnerships are you working on when you're looking for the athletes who might compete in 2028 or 2032? How widespread a program is it?
It's probably a lot less than most would expect. We go for quality over quantity. And so we're always, like I said, seeking out what is going to be that next breakthrough talent, but really making sure that first and foremost that they uphold the values of our brand. We've said no to a lot more athletes than we've said yes to. And that's just because, like I said, we want high quality athletes that not only perform well on the track, but perform really good in the community and really support our culture and our values.
But those things like brand values, how do you identify those in what is presumably an athlete, not just an early stage of their career, but an early stage of their life? Because people who go on to become Olympian track and field athletes, they're already on that pathway when they're barely in high school, right?
Yeah, exactly. 100%. You're right.
So how do you figure out which ones are going to do a good job of representing you at that point?
Yeah, I mean,
people change.
I'm fortunate for us. They change for the good, the athletes that we have. But yeah, you always run that risk of as you go from becoming that amateur athlete to becoming in the limelight, things do change and personalities change. But generally, we get a pretty good sense for how these athletes handle themselves, how involved they are in the community. And those tend to be things that don't change over time. If anything, it just gets more and more part of who they are. I reference Sydney McLaughlin, Femke Bol, Gabby Thomas, Vernon Norwood. I mean, these are amazing athletes that are competing at the highest levels of the sport. When you talk to them, it's not about track and field. It's about what they're doing out there in the world that they're most proud about, which is really exciting for us.
So beyond furnishing them with the shoes, just finally, how does New Balance help them prepare, say, especially for a big event like this?
Yes, we have a brand new state-of-the-art sports research facility at our global world headquarters in Boston. And so leading up to the Olympics, we're spending a lot of time with the athletes in the lab, making sure that their biomechanics, nutrition, just all of that is, tight, and making sure that they're feeling really good and prepared. So it's a lot less about the equipment and more about the holistic athlete in their body and just making sure that they feel prepared.
Kevin FitzPatrick, New Balance's Global Vice President of Running, thank you for joining us. You are listening to Monocle on Saturday with me, Andrew Mueller. We're joined now by Monocle's roving Olympics correspondent, Kieran Pender. He is as ever, the heart of the action. Kieran, good morning. Should we start by gloating a bit about how many gold medals Australia has won by now?
Yeah, Australia is having an excellent Olympics so far. 11 golds after a frenetic evening of action last night, 2 in the pool, 1 in the BMX racing, which means Australia is currently joint second with France on the medal tally. Australia's best ever Olympic performance is 17 golds in Tokyo and in Athens. So that record looks in danger.
Unless, of course, we are heavily reliant on the sailing, where I believe, Kieran, things have been a little slow.
Australia actually has 2 quite good medal prospects in the sailing, at least 2, including someone who hopefully will go today in the windsurfing for gold. But there's been a bit of a problem of late. So the sailing at these Olympics is taking place off Marseille in the beautiful waters of the Mediterranean. But for the past couple of days, there's been no wind. One of the problems of having an Olympics in a Mediterranean summer when people are relaxing by the beach and the summer sort of heat is keeping the wind at bay is that it's difficult to sail. So a bunch of the sailing program's been forced to be postponed, delayed. So potentially some medals there today and tomorrow, but otherwise they'll have to pray that a storm hits the Mediterranean and then they can actually do some sailing.
Kieran, people who tune into Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk later today, and really who wouldn't, will be reminded that there is always a political subtext or subtexts to any Olympic Games. One of the people we are speaking to is somebody who competed not for Afghanistan directly, because that's very difficult, but for the Afghan refugee team. But here at Paris as well, there is another Afghan athlete who has something to say to the people now running her country.
Yeah, there was a remarkable story at the track yesterday. Kimia Yusufi, one of the members of the 6-person Afghan team competing at these games, ran in the 100-metre heats. And she afterwards held up a piece of paper that said education, sport and our rights in the colours of the Afghan flag. Afterwards, she said to one of my colleagues, I have a message for Afghan girls: don't give up, don't let others decide for you, just search for opportunity and then use that opportunity. Obviously, the inclusion of Afghanistan in these games, in other international sporting events, has been a point of controversy ever since the Taliban took control in August 2021. Yusufi managed to flee and now resides in Australia. The Taliban only recognises the male athletes, so there's 3 male and 3 female Afghan athletes competing. In Paris, the Taliban government has said that it only recognises the 3 male athletes, sort of effectively ignoring the female athletes, but they're certainly trying to use their platform to raise the ongoing human rights violations of the Afghan Taliban government, including to all of the women and girls in Afghanistan. So a very touching moment at the track yesterday.
And Kieran, just finally, what seems like a pretty minor Olympic scandal, I don't know if we're sticking a gate on the end of this just yet, but some suggestion that judges are not necessarily keeping a correct professional distance in some instances from the competitors.
Well, I guess we might call it selfie gate. So surfing is happening at these games halfway around the world in Tahiti, but the distance has not led to this minor controversy getting the typical Olympic sort of media attention that it probably didn't really deserve. An incident in Tahiti involving an Australian judge. So surfing is a subjective sport. You have a panel of judges from different nationalities. Their scores are sort of combined and averaged to deliver a score. Brazil has for a long time had it out against an Australian judge on the World Surf League, a guy called Ben Lowe, who they believe is biased against the Brazilian surfers. Unfortunately for Lowe, an image emerged from Tahiti of him posing with one of the Australian surfers, Ethan Ewing, and the Australian coach, B. Durbidge. Those 3 are all from a small town. Town's probably putting it to a small part of Australia, Stradbroke, off southern Queensland. And that was purely sort of to highlight that local connection. The caption on the photos, these 3 Stratty boys doing their stuff at the Olympics, probably ill-advised. Unfortunately, the Brazilians found out about this online. There was much furore. And ultimately, the International Surfing Association decided that it wasn't tenable for Lowe to remain at these games. A Brazilian team official came out and said, this is good for us. This situation is clearly not right. Interestingly, analysis I've just seen from a surf media outlet suggested that at these games, his judging had actually been, if you crunch the numbers, better off for the Brazilians than otherwise. So perhaps they'll come to regret having him kicked off the judging panel. But of course, whenever you have judges in a sporting event, it's important that you have the highest levels of propriety and integrity. But I think taking a photo with some people that from your hometown as well is probably a bit of a stretch.
Kieran Pender, thank you for joining us. This is Monocle on Saturday with me, Andrew Mueller, live in Paris. And as we discussed earlier, the Olympics is obviously a showcase for more established athletic brands, but at least one premium sportswear brand is hoping to use Paris as something of a launchpad. I'm joined now by the founders of Yves Roger Athletics, Leonard Engelman and Yves Roger. Welcome both to Monocle on Saturday.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Both, first of all, because we've been asking everybody, I'll ask you first, Yves, for your impressions of week 1 of the Games. Have you been enjoying Paris and its Olympics?
Not yet.
What are you looking forward to?
Actually, we haven't been able to follow the Games so much. We've been working on our brand so hard that we were stuck in the bubble, being in the lab. And now we're getting somehow relaxed for the second week and trying to follow a bit more. We've been just stuck in Le Marais in our pop-up that we just opened. So that's why we're a little bit speechless and not as knowledgeable about the Games as we should be. But yeah, we're going to be next week.
But Yves, you do have an Olympic connection to the Winter Games in Sochi particularly.
Yes. Let's say... back in the day, so I'm from Togo, West Africa. And so back in the day, we used to have some kind of crazy idea, like African country, like a tropical country. So we both came from Germany. We live in Germany, in Munich. But back in the day, we were living in Wiesbaden. So I used to have some kind of good friends. And so one time we went to holiday, like a ski holiday. So then I was having this kind of idea, asking my friends, so what do you think about creating Togo Ski Federation? So, what? Togo Ski Federation? How come? I say, yeah. So, and then we was having a little bit discussion about the way we are going to create it and have some kind of crazy idea. And yeah, that's how it's happened.
And then you went to what? To Sochi?
And then later, then we create the ski association in Germany first, and after 1 year, so we went back to Togo, went to the government and present our idea and the concept. So they were laughing about us.
I mean,
they say like we never hear those kind of crazy idea, but if it's true, then we're going to support you.
I mean, yeah, Togo, I think it's correct to emphasize, is not a natural skiing hotbed, is it?
Never. Never. Not at all.
They don't get too much snow.
Yeah.
But that does,
we never even have snow.
But it does kind of bring us to your brand, because that melding, I guess, of Olympic ideals, African tradition. What do you think, distinctive about Yves Roger and what you're trying to do with it?
I can tell that Yves Roger, the idea come from the Ski Federation, because we used to produce those ski sportwear and garments and everything. So after the COVID, so me and Leonard, we met us almost 7 years ago, and I was telling him that I see that the business with ski sportwear and it has going low a little bit. And then we have idea to create another type of the sportwear. We're talking about seamless sport, fitness wear, and all those casual shoe and t-shirt and all those. So he have some kind of great idea, and he make me some kind of good idea, proposing how
we met at a carpool. We were like stereotypically meeting at a carpool, and Roger told me about the story about taking the first Togo ski team to the Olympics, which I don't know, that's just so counterintuitive, but that's how his character is, having crazy ideas and realizing them. And I'm a creative, I'm a designer, and we have been working on some designs, and I was really struck with the idea and the vision of creating of Roger's vision of creating an African sports brand. And that does not exist.
Well, which does seem weird in itself. I mean, when you talked about it, did it strike you as a fairly obvious gap in the market that nobody was spotting? Because obviously, maybe not so much with the skiing, but the continent of Africa does have a fantastic athletic heritage.
Yeah, that's why we call it athleticism is culture. And it just felt so natural, even though we couldn't be any more different. But we teamed up and we saw the opportunity of and so many brands reaching out to Africa and tapping into the culture, which I think is a great thing, to share the culture, to explore it, to tell the stories. I think it's very underrepresented in media, in sports. And now, 7 years later, 4 years after deciding to go for the brand of creating a real, authentic, new interpretation of a brand that taps into cultural heritage of Africa, but merging it with a new, also European minimalism, that's my side obviously, of streetwear, but also athletic performance and active wear. We saw it felt just natural to go in there because we didn't have to copy anybody. We didn't have to look left and right. We just talked about it. And Roger just educated me about so many things. And here we are with our first edition with Love from Africa. And we have...
Which is our bestseller.
Just finally, in terms of how you see this brand developing, have you had any interest from African athletics federations about supplying equipment for their athletes or clothes for their athletes, or is that something you would like to do in future?
Yes, of course. This is our idea. This is the way, I can tell that in Africa, there are so many good athletes or like athlete, like football player or basket player, but they don't have any opportunity. It's very difficult for African to invest in the equipment. So this is the future. We say like, let us prove it or come out and prove it a little bit, and then later on, then we just turn back to Africa and help those kind of people, because we already have some kind of organization like children support, Yves Roger Athletic, children,
Foundation.
Foundation, yes.
And so next time Togo's ski team goes to the Winter Games, they could be wearing Yves Roger?
Exactly. This is our wish. Exactly.
Yves Roger and Leonard Engelman, thank you both very much for joining us. You are listening to Monocle on Saturday, and the Yves Roger pop-up store is available and open in Le Marais until August 18th.
Correct.
So do drop by if you are in Paris. This is Monocle on Saturday. You are listening to Monocle on Saturday with me, Andrew Mueller. Now, over 460 Australian athletes are competing for medals in 329 events at the Paris Games, with 11 gold medals so far. At the very real risk of appearing to gloat, the only nations ahead of us on the medal table as of this broadcast are France, which has the advantage of being at home, and China, which has the advantage of 56 times the people. Meanwhile, things are going less well back in the old country for Australian regional carrier and possibly owner of the least well-thought-through name in the history of aviation, i.e. Rex Airlines. That's REX, it feels important to note, which has gone into administration. Well, joining us now for the latest on aviation and Australia's magnificent performance so far at Paris 2024 is the journalist and broadcaster Paul Osbourne. Paul, good afternoon, good morning, or whatever it is where you are. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from Australia, where yes, we're settling in for another 14-hour shift of out-of-hours Olympic viewing. I mean, it's not like you need somebody else to act as a cheerleader for you, but as you say, third place so far in the medal table. Cynics would say this is perhaps because the opening major act of the Olympics is swimming, and Australia may have a slight competitive advantage there. We move into the athletics. There's no slouch, the Australians, when it comes to the track and field as well. But perhaps the pressure to keep that third place might be a little difficult as we move into the second week. But so far, so good. And the media coverage here, as you can imagine, is about the blaze of green and gold through the pool and elsewhere picking up medals.
Well, I did want to ask about this, Paul, because readers alert to the differences in the English-speaking accents will have discerned that you are not, in fact, a native of Australia. As an expatriate Englishman in Australia, are you finding all this completely unbearable, or have you gone native by now?
No, not quite. I'm in the position where I wish Australia well in every event except the ones where they're competing with a genuine British medal prospect. The frustration, it's not like being in the United States, where if you watch the Olympics on television in the US, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that any other countries were even involved. It isn't quite like that. There is an acknowledgement, for example, of Léon Marchand, the French swimmer, has received a huge amount of coverage here, and people talking about his astonishing achievements. It's a little thin on the ground sometimes. I mean, obviously, it would be wrong of me to say that there are ways that if you want to, you can catch up with the way the Olympics is being covered in another country. That would be illicit and something I would absolutely not encourage, and I definitely haven't been doing it.
Quite right, too. But obviously, the city you are broadcasting from is 2 more games away from being an Olympic city. It will be Australia's 3rd Olympic city after Melbourne 56 and Sydney 2000. Are Brisbaneites looking at Paris and thinking, what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? What should we be learning from this?
what it has done is it's really shone a light on the political arguments that have been going on in Brisbane the last couple of years about how big the Olympics will be, how to deliver it without going hugely into the red. And you saw not that long ago that Melbourne gave up on hosting the Commonwealth Games, and it wasn't just going to be, it was going to be across wider Victoria, saying that they just couldn't afford to do it. It wasn't worth spending, in their view, billions of dollars for this sports event. Now, the Olympics is of a significantly greater magnitude, but there's been a lot of argument here about whether you build new stadiums, or you spend huge amounts of money upgrading major stadiums, or do you repurpose the existing infrastructure? Now, Brisbane's the first Olympic host since Los Angeles in 1984 to be awarded the Olympic Games unchallenged without even applying for it. They just went into negotiations and agreed with the IOC that they would host in 2032. Now, LA agreed to host the 84 Olympics because they plan to use existing infrastructure. And as a consequence, it's the only Olympic Games in the last 50, 60 years that hasn't lost money. But the likelihood of that happening for Brisbane is incredibly low. But at the moment, there is this argument about using an old swimming pool on the outskirts of Brisbane for the swimming events, of repurposing other stadiums rather than significantly investing in upgrading one of the major stadiums in Brisbane. Now, the issue is there is a state election coming up in Queensland in 2 months' time, and the polls would suggest there's going to be a change of government when that happens, and that the Labour government that's ruled Queensland for a long time now will be replaced by the Liberal National Party in Queensland. Now, if that happens, that will lead to a significant change in the attitude to the Olympics, to the structure of it. And you have this competing pressure that on the one hand, there is this view from politicians, they don't want to be wasting money on a sports event. And we've just seen, Victoria and Melbourne say they don't want to do that. But on the other hand, what the Paris Olympics does is it demonstrates that for those 2 weeks, the eyes of the entire world are on you 24 hours a day. That is a huge opportunity to promote yourself. And Brisbane is not as well known as Sydney or Melbourne. But of course, if it all goes wrong, that is also something that won't be forgotten. Ask, for example, the people connected to the Atlanta Games in 1996.
And indeed, the Montreal Games of 1976, so I don't think go out yet without a bag over their head with 2 eye holes cut out of it. We should talk finally, Paul, about Rex Airlines, the amusingly named regional carrier of Australia, which I have relied on many times to cart myself between one or other capital and my relatives in Wagga Wagga, whose airport was sort of built to accommodate Rex's smaller aircraft. Where has it all gone wrong for Rex? Are there simply not enough people, incredible though this sounds, flying to Wagga Wagga?
It's, hard as it may be to believe, they had ambitions that stretched beyond the estimable airport of Wagga Wagga. What happened was that just after COVID, Virgin Australia, the second domestic airline in the country, went into administration, from which it eventually emerged. But Rex, which, as you say, had concentrated on connecting regional areas of Australia, regional towns with the capital cities, decided to expand into what's called the Golden Triangle, which is this hugely profitable network of routes between Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. That is dominated by Qantas and Virgin, which, as I say, emerged from administration and survived. Rex bought some bigger planes. It bought them having got $150 million of investment from a private equity company. It hasn't gone brilliantly for them. One of the reasons being getting slots at Sydney Airport, being able to actually take off and land, is becoming a bit of an issue for them. And it means that capital city route, the Golden Triangle routes, were costing the company $1 million a week to maintain. Now, the regional bit was sort of going okay, but there was the capital city bit that was draining the money. There was a boardroom revolt a few weeks ago, which saw the Singaporean businessman Lim Kim Hai, who owns about half the shares in Rex, forced out as executive chairman, him blaming that private equity firm, saying that they pushed him out. Now, Rex has stopped selling tickets on those capital city flights. They are still, at the moment, selling tickets for those regional flights. That's only guaranteed for about the next 4 weeks or so as the administrators try to find a way to restructure the business. And the federal government is involved here because Rex receives government subsidies to keep those regional air links going. And in many cases, it's the only air link to some of these places. And so politically, they don't want to see the airline go under. But that doesn't mean that they're willing to help it move into that highly competitive commercial market linking the 3 biggest cities in Australia. And the other issue would be, would they be willing to go against Qantas in particular, but also Virgin, in telling the authorities at Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane that they have to open more slots to open up competition for a third airline. So the assumption is the Rex will emerge from this going back to its roots as a regional airline. It will abandon the attempt to take a slice of the profits from the Golden Triangle. But even then, reports this week have said whoever ends up taking over Rex is going to have some very deep pockets, because its fleet of aircraft that it uses on those regional routes is pretty old and needs a bit of sprucing up. So even if the capital city thing goes, they are going to have to spend a lot of money to get back in the game properly.
Just finally and briefly, Paul, this does tap into an ongoing angst that has been enveloping Australian aviation for as long as I can remember, and I can remember back to the rivalry between Ansett and TAA, neither of which are still with us. But is there actually meaningfully room in Australia for a third airline? Because it's not just Rex having its troubles. We've also seen the insufferably named budget airline Bonza come and go in very short order in recent times as well.
Yeah, people got very excited about Bonza because not only the name, but also the fact that it was connecting a lot of the sort of medium-sized airports and offering cheaper tickets into those capital cities. So, for example, about an hour north of where I am in Brisbane, there is what they call the Sunshine Coast Airport at Maroochydore, and you could get which is where Bonza was based, and you could get a very cheap flight down to Sydney if you flew with Bonza. But they bought some very expensive planes, or leased some very expensive planes. They did not factor in the cost of setting up an airline properly. They went bust overnight. Their staff were told that they would not be paid, and were actually told they needed to go off to the government benefits offices, the Centrelink offices, to get enough money to pay the rent and put the food on the plates for the next week or so. So, yeah, I mean, Bonza was very much sort of phoenixing from the flames. But the problem with Rex is that it does fulfill this very important job of linking these regional towns and cities to the major cities in Australia. But in terms of really getting into the big market, the big city markets, it is taking on Virgin Australia, which is a very strong position after its administration, and of course Qantas, which is an absolutely massive airline, which also operates its own budget airline, Jetstar. And so between those two airlines, and particularly the dominance they have on the domestic slots in and out of Sydney, it is very hard to see how any third airline could possibly break through unless it had someone behind it who was willing to swallow not just the $1 million a week losses that Rex has been running up, trying to break in, but probably bigger losses for a longer period, with still no real guarantee that you would be able to break that duopoly. Australia often points to the size of the country and the geographic spread of the population as the reason why you can't have more than 2 supermarket chains. You can only have 1 or 2 newspapers in each market. And similarly, the people, particularly the people running Qantas and Virgin, would say the market simply isn't big enough to take more than 2 airlines. Now, they would say that, wouldn't they? But at the same time, so far, everyone who's tried to break into that market has failed.
Paul Osbourne in Brisbane, thank you for joining us. And that is all for this edition of Monocle on Saturday, live from Paris. Thanks to Georgina Godwin and all our guests today: Tyler Brûlé, Colette Davidson, Kevin FitzPatrick, Leonard Engelman, Yves Roger, Kieran Pender and Paul Osbourne. Thanks to our team in Paris, producer Carlotta Rebello, studio managers David Stevens and Lily Austin, also to Mariella Bevan back in London. Join us tomorrow at the same time for more from Paris. Monocle on Saturday will be back, still in Paris next week. I'm Andrew Mueller. Until then, enjoy the rest of the weekend.